There's a particular kind of invitation that lands differently on a female empath than it does on almost anyone else in her friend group. And it has nothing to do with the event itself, nothing to do with disliking the people who'll be there, nothing to do with introversion in the simple, popular sense most people use that word. It's an invitation to something perfectly ordinary, a birthday dinner, a night out, a casual gathering, and while everyone else in the group chat responds with immediate excitement, she feels something closer to a quiet internal calculation beginning almost automatically, a weighing of costs that has nothing to do with whether she wants to see these people and everything to do with what going actually requires of her, specifically in a way it simply doesn't require of most people around her. Today I want to talk about why this happens, why so many female empaths genuinely, consistently prefer staying home over going out, and why this preference, so often misread as antisocial or overly cautious, actually reflects something far more sophisticated happening beneath the surface. The first thing worth understanding before we get into the specific reasons is what going out actually costs a female empath that it doesn't cost most other people in the same room. For someone without heightened emotional attunement, a social gathering is largely just that, a gathering, an exchange of conversation, a few hours of pleasant or unpleasant interaction that ends when the evening ends. For a female empath, the same gathering involves an entirely additional layer of labor happening simultaneously and mostly invisibly, a constant background process of reading the room, sensing undercurrents, noticing who's uncomfortable, who's performing happiness they don't actually feel, who's quietly upset about something nobody else has picked up on yet. This isn't optional awareness she can simply switch off for the evening. It's an involuntary feature of how her nervous system processes environments filled with other people, and it means that by the time a typical night out ends, she hasn't just experienced the event the way everyone else has. She's processed an entire second layer of emotional data most people in the room never even generated consciously, let alone noticed being absorbed by someone else. The second reason involves something specific to environments that emphasize performance over presence, which describes an enormous number of typical social outings: loud restaurants, crowded bars, large parties where genuine conversation gets replaced by surface-level small talk repeated across multiple people in rapid succession. Female empaths often experience this specific kind of socializing as uniquely depleting, not because they dislike people, but because surface-level interaction requires a kind of performed engagement that feels fundamentally different from the deep, genuine connection they're actually built for. Making small talk with someone you'll never really connect with, performing enthusiasm about a topic that doesn't interest you, navigating a loud, chaotic environment where genuine listening becomes nearly impossible. All of this asks her to spend real energy on interaction that doesn't offer the kind of depth that would actually replenish her in return. Home, by contrast, offers the option of either genuine solitude or, when company is present, the kind of unhurried, undistracted depth she can't access in a crowded, noisy public setting. The third reason has to do with sensory processing specifically, something that overlaps significantly with heightened emotional sensitivity, but deserves its own separate attention. Many female empaths process ambient sensory input, noise, lighting, movement, crowding, with unusually high intensity, meaning that environments most people experience as simply lively or energetic register for her as something closer to genuine sensory overload. A restaurant that feels pleasantly buzzing to everyone else might feel to her nervous system like a constant assault of competing stimuli, each demanding a small amount of processing bandwidth that adds up quickly across an entire evening. This isn't pickiness, and it isn't something she can simply push through with enough willpower, because sensory processing differences aren't primarily about mindset. They're about how a nervous system is actually wired to filter and prioritize incoming stimulation, and no amount of wanting to enjoy a loud environment changes the underlying physiological cost of actually being in it. The fourth reason involves the specific social role female empaths so often find themselves occupying within any group setting, a role we've discussed before, but that bears repeating here because of how directly it connects to this particular pattern. In almost any group of more than 2 or 3 people, a female empath tends to become, whether she consciously chooses this role or not, the person managing the group's emotional temperature, smoothing over an awkward moment, redirecting a conversation that's veering into uncomfortable territory, checking in privately with someone who seems off, even while maintaining the group's overall flow. This labor is genuinely valuable, genuinely appreciated by the people who benefit from it, and almost entirely invisible to everyone except the person performing it. Going out, for her, rarely means simply attending an event. It means attending an event while simultaneously managing its underlying emotional dynamics, largely alone, without anyone else in the group even aware that this additional layer of work is happening at all. The fifth reason is more specific to romantic and social dynamics involving strangers or acquaintances rather than close friends, and it involves the particular vigilance female empaths often maintain in unfamiliar social settings, a vigilance built from years of learning to read people accurately before fully trusting them. Going out frequently means encountering new people at a party, a bar, a larger social gathering. And for a female empath, meeting someone new isn't simply a pleasant, low-stakes interaction. It's an active, largely unconscious process of assessment, gauging sincerity, noticing inconsistencies between what someone says and how their energy actually feels, staying alert to signals that most people in the room aren't even registering as information worth tracking. This vigilance, while protective and genuinely valuable, is also exhausting in a way that home, filled only with people whose safety has already been established over time, simply doesn't require. The sixth reason involves something less discussed but genuinely significant: the specific difficulty many female empaths experience with the anticipated aftermath of socializing, not just the event itself. This is worth naming clearly, because it's often what actually tips the decision toward staying home, rather than the event itself. She's not just weighing the cost of the evening. She's weighing the cost of the day or two afterward, the period psychologists sometimes call an empathy hangover, where all the emotional data absorbed during the outing needs time and quiet to actually process and settle. If her week is already full, if she doesn't have adequate recovery time built in afterward, the anticipated cost of that recovery period, layered on top of the evening itself, often makes staying home feel like the only genuinely sustainable choice available, even when part of her would enjoy the event itself if the surrounding cost weren't factored into the calculation. The seventh reason, and this one deserves particular attention because it's so frequently misunderstood by the people around her, is that home represents one of the only environments where she gets to fully set down the constant monitoring, translating, and managing that defines so much of her interaction with the world outside it. This isn't about disliking people. It's about the simple physiological reality that her nervous system needs regular, substantial periods of genuine rest from a particular kind of labor most people never have to perform at all. And home, specifically, is where that rest becomes actually possible, rather than simply theoretical. Choosing to stay home isn't a rejection of connection. It's a recognition, built from real, lived experience, of what her specific nervous system actually requires in order to keep functioning well enough to offer genuine presence the next time she does choose to go out. I want to pause here and say something important about how this pattern tends to get misread by the people around her, because the misreading itself often adds an unnecessary layer of guilt on top of a preference that's actually rooted in genuine self-knowledge rather than antisocial avoidance. Friends and family who don't share this specific wiring often interpret her preference for staying home as flakiness, as low effort, as evidence that she doesn't value the relationship or the invitation enough to push through minor discomfort the way everyone else seems able to. This interpretation misses almost everything actually happening beneath the surface. She isn't avoiding minor discomfort. She's protecting against a genuine, measurable depletion that operates on a completely different scale than what most people in her life are actually weighing when they decide whether to attend something. Comparing her calculation to theirs is comparing two fundamentally different equations, and expecting her answer to match everyone else's assumes, incorrectly, that the underlying variables are the same for everyone in the room. Comparing her calculation to theirs is comparing two fundamentally different equations, and expecting her answer to match everyone else's assumes, incorrectly, that the underlying variables are the same for everyone in the room. And this is exactly where I want to take the rest of our conversation, because understanding why she prefers staying home is only useful if it also helps her, and everyone who loves her, build a life that actually accommodates this reality instead of quietly fighting against it, event after event, invitation after invitation, year after year. The first thing worth addressing directly is the guilt that so often accompanies this preference, because it tends to compound the exhaustion rather than simply existing alongside it. Many female empaths don't just experience the cost of going out or the relief of staying home, they experience an additional layer of self-judgment on top of both. A persistent internal voice suggesting that preferring solitude makes her a bad friend, an ungrateful daughter, an inadequate partner, someone who should simply try harder to be the kind of person who enjoys going out the way everyone else seems to. I want to address this directly because it deserves real, honest correction. Needing more recovery time than the people around you is not a character flaw. It's a physiological reality, no different in principle than needing more sleep than someone else, or having a lower tolerance for a particular food, or requiring more time to recover from physical exertion than an especially athletic friend. Nobody would call a person morally deficient for needing 8 hours of sleep instead of 5. The same standard deserves to apply here, even though our culture rarely extends it as generously to emotional and sensory processing as it does to more visible physical needs. The second thing worth understanding is how to actually communicate this need clearly to the people in her life, because silence around this pattern tends to produce far more damage than honesty ever could, even though honesty can feel, in the moment, like it risks disappointing people she cares about. Most female empaths, faced with an invitation they know will cost more than they currently have available, default to vague excuses. "I'm just really tired. Maybe next time. I have a lot going on." Explanations that are technically true, but leave enough ambiguity that the person receiving them often fills in the gap with a less generous interpretation than what's actually happening. Learning to say something more specific and more honest. "I do better with quieter, smaller gatherings than big nights out, and I want to actually be present when we do connect, so I'm going to pass on this one and would love to grab coffee, just the two of us instead." Gives the people who matter genuine information they can actually work with, rather than leaving them to construct their own explanation for a pattern they don't yet understand. The third thing worth exploring is the importance of building a social life that's actually designed around her specific needs, rather than continuing to force herself into a default social structure built for people whose processing works differently. This might mean deliberately cultivating smaller, quieter forms of connection alongside, or even instead of, the larger group gatherings that tend to deplete her most severely. One-on-one coffee dates instead of large group dinners, quiet walks instead of loud bars, hosting a small, intimate gathering in her own controlled environment rather than attending someone else's larger, less predictable one. This isn't about avoiding connection altogether, it's about recognizing that connection can take many different shapes, and that the specific shape most culturally celebrated, big, frequent, spontaneous social gatherings, simply isn't the shape that actually works best for how her particular nervous system is built to connect meaningfully with other people. The fourth thing worth understanding is how to distinguish honestly between genuine depletion that warrants staying home and a more anxious avoidance that might actually benefit from gentle pushing through, because not every instance of preferring to stay home is pure nervous system protection. Sometimes, particularly with events that matter to her, the discomfort is worth examining a little more closely before automatically declining. A useful distinction here involves asking whether the anticipated cost feels manageable with adequate preparation and recovery time built in, or whether it feels overwhelming regardless of preparation, because the first often indicates a genuine, addressable capacity question, while the second sometimes indicates something more specific worth exploring, whether that's social anxiety, a particular dynamic with specific people that deserve separate attention, or simply an accumulated depletion from other areas of life that's making even normally manageable socializing feel disproportionately costly right now. The fifth thing, and this one requires real practice, is learning to build in deliberate recovery time before and after events that genuinely matter to her, rather than scheduling social commitments back to back with no buffer, which tends to make the empathy hangover we discussed earlier significantly worse and often becomes the actual reason staying home starts to feel necessary, even for events she'd otherwise genuinely want to attend. This might mean protecting the day before an important gathering as deliberately quiet, ensuring she's not running on an already depleted reserve before the additional cost of the event itself arrives. It might mean protecting the day after as equally quiet, giving her nervous system the space it needs to actually process and integrate everything absorbed during the outing, rather than immediately layering another demand on top of an already full processing queue. This kind of deliberate structuring doesn't eliminate the cost of socializing, but it does make that cost genuinely sustainable in a way that constant back-to-back commitments never quite manage to be. I want to say something important here about what this pattern actually protects, beyond simple energy conservation, because I think it reframes the entire preference in a way that matters. The specific quality of presence a female empath brings to the relationships and gatherings she does choose to attend, when she's adequately rested and genuinely has the capacity to be there, tends to be remarkably rich, remarkably attuned, remarkably different from what she'd be capable of offering if she said yes to everything and showed up perpetually depleted instead. Her preference for staying home isn't just about avoiding cost. It's about protecting the very quality that makes her presence so valuable in the first place, ensuring that when she does show up, she's actually able to offer the depth, the attentiveness, the genuine emotional presence that makes people feel truly seen around her, rather than a hollowed-out, exhausted version of herself simply going through the motions of attendance. And here's something worth sitting with. Something that I think matters enormously for how she relates to this pattern going forward. The specific nervous system wiring that makes going out cost so much is the exact same wiring that makes her capable of the deep, attuned presence that draws people to her in the first place. These aren't two separate traits existing independently, one inconvenient and one valuable. They're the same underlying sensitivity, expressed in two different contexts. The heightened awareness that makes a crowded restaurant genuinely overwhelming is the same heightened awareness that lets her sense exactly when a friend needs support before that friend has even said a word. You cannot selectively keep one and discard the other. The depth she offers and the cost she pays for that depth are two expressions of a single underlying capacity, and learning to honor the cost, rather than fighting against it or feeling ashamed of it, is actually what protects her ability to keep offering the depth that makes her relationships so genuinely valuable in the first place. So picture this, the way we often close these conversations. Not a woman isolating herself entirely, not someone slowly withdrawing from connection altogether out of exhaustion or resentment, but someone learning, slowly, deliberately, to build a life that honors what she actually needs rather than what she's been taught she's supposed to want. Picture her, on an ordinary evening, declining an invitation to a loud, crowded gathering without the familiar guilt that used to accompany every such decision, choosing instead a quiet evening at home, genuinely restorative rather than simply avoidant, followed the next week by a small, intimate dinner with one close friend, where she shows up fully present, fully engaged, offering the exact depth of connection that a larger, more depleting gathering would never have allowed her the capacity to give. Because that is the real, quiet truth beneath everything we've explored today. She was never someone who dislikes people, never someone choosing isolation over connection out of fear or avoidance. She was someone who understood, sometimes before she even had the language for it, that her particular gift for depth required particular conditions to actually function well. And that honoring those conditions wasn't selfishness, wasn't social failure, wasn't evidence of something wrong with her. It was simply the quiet, necessary work of protecting the exact capacity that made her worth knowing in the first place. so that when she finally did choose to show up, whoever was waiting for her actually got to meet her fully, rather than a tired, depleted version of herself, running on a reserve that had already been spent long before she ever walked through the door.